The studio showdown spiraled out of control from the very first moment. The pro-Labour guest tried to downplay the scandals, brushing them off as media lies. But his rival exploded, accusing the party of corruption and covering up the darkest truths. The tension soared, voices clashed, and every response hit harder than the last. The host stood powerless against the torrent of accusations, until the crushing line was delivered. A line that shattered the room's composure and left everyone stunned. What was said, and why did it hit so hard? Watch until the end, and share your honest thoughts in the comments.
Did you know over 95% of our viewers aren't subscribed? Subscribing is free and helps us create more great content. Hit subscribe now and join our community.
In terms of human rights, of going to a country like Rwanda.
You've been there.
Yeah.
You went there with Suella Braverman when she was the Home Secretary a few years ago now. What was your read on the situation when you went out there from that perspective, human rights violations, etc.?
Well, I think the human rights claims that were made by Labour in opposition and by the human rights lobby were vastly overplayed. I was very impressed with what I saw in Rwanda, and speaking to government officials in Rwanda as well, they have a very different outlook on the immigration issue and what can be done to help, because they come from a standpoint of having lived through the Rwandan genocide, where so many people in that country became refugees themselves and left that area in Africa to go all around the world. Slowly but surely, many have been drifting back, and they take with them an attitude now where they want to do the very best for people on the continent of Africa, to stop them embarking on thousands of miles on treacherous journeys to go to Western nations to try to find a new life. This is an emerging economy. It is absolutely, a powerhouse in terms of new technology. They need a migrant population to help in that journey, but they want to do it as well because they feel it's a responsible thing to do. And yes, of course, there are some issues around whether they are as we would see, fully democratic, and that all of the human rights are observed. But as I say, I think that's a bit overplayed. They've been on a journey from this period with the genocide. They've got a strong man in charge at the moment, but they're still pushing forward. They are becoming, or trying to become, ever more open as a society. But of course, at the same time, they realise what has happened before in terms of divisions in that society, and they're reluctant perhaps to throw open their doors to activists. But if you're going there to build a new life, to be part of that burgeoning new economy, I am fully convinced you'd have a great life there in Rwanda. It was a remarkable country, lots of housing that was being provided, built for them, housing that, would have taken pride of place in any street in the UK. That was being set aside for migrants had that actual policy managed to get off the ground from the previous government.
It's a rare example, perhaps, of foreign aid spending and support for an East African country that would really actually just directly benefit Britain as well. It could have been some of the most effective foreign aid spending or government spending overseas that we'd had. Now, at the same time, obviously, do you get a sense, perhaps, a lot of the Labour activists, now MPs and ministers, who are so crude and dismissive of that policy, are sort of kicking themselves, thinking, if only we hadn't used such strong language, there could have been a way for us to swallow our pride and go back to that deterrent? Because you speak about sort of the human rights concerns in Rwanda. In your case, you think that's been overplayed a bit by the opposition, now government. But at the same time that that's being sort of drum up, you have Germany deporting Afghans back to Afghanistan, run by the Islamic Emirate, the Taliban. So the rest of the continent is moving in a very different direction on this issue, and Labour is still sticking on the idea that the Rwanda scheme was cruel, evil, and wrapped up in human rights violations. At some point, Labour will need to move more in line with what the Europeans are doing, no?
And I think to an extent they are doing that. If not looking at Rwanda, they are looking at other locations that are perhaps a bit closer to home on the continent of Europe or not far away in that sense. They were looking at Albania, for instance, until the Albanian leader decided that at the end of the day he didn't want to hatch any kind of deal with the UK government, that they were fine the way they are. But yeah, I think there's a considerable number of people within Labour, within the parliamentary party, that probably thought, let's give Rwanda a go. You never know. And I do think that actually Rwanda would have stood a chance had they been committed to it. You mentioned the trip I was on with Suella Braverman over there. We were privileged to get a sort of a briefing about how they saw the Rwanda policy being carried out. And it seemed to be the plan and the objective of them that in the first instance, for a period of time, might be weeks, it might have gone into months, 100% of those coming across the channel would have gone to Rwanda. And they thought that actually a few thousand down, and that would have broken the business model. Now, that might be right, it might be wrong. We'll never know now. But I think there's a pretty good chance. If you're coming from Africa, or if you're coming from the Middle East or Asia or wherever, and you're paying thousands of pounds to a people smuggler, to know that you're then not going to land in the country that was your ultimate destination that you wanted to land in, probably in quite short order, you're not going to be paying money to a people smuggler to take you. So it could well have collapsed the business model.
Yeah, and as these sort of hypothetical debates continue, that could be real debates happening inside the Labour Party as they sort of desperately seek more deals and more opportunities to speed up deportations and deal with this small boats crisis. We do know that while all that's going on, the numbers are atrocious for this year. I remember a few months ago I was reporting down near Dover and I stole one of your lines. I interviewed a Labour MP and I said, you say you're smashing the gangs so far, you're just smashing records, which you were a little bit annoyed that I'd taken. But
not at all.
Not at all. You're delighted to see it. Delighted to see that one being spun out and me claiming it was my own. But that is true, isn't it? The numbers really are appalling. I mean, every time we check in on the statistical comparison, it's about 40% up from last year. Now, the last thing that Sir Keir Starmer wants is a year and a half into his premiership, it comes to the end of 2025, and they've had one of the worst years on record. Do you think that that record could be smashed?
Well, I think we're certainly going to pass last year's record. So that was 36,000. We're now 32,000 and rising because of the latest sort of numbers that have come across the channel. And we're told from our very well-sourced and expert producer down in Kent that later this month, or for the remainder of the month, there will be a few days which are still doable in terms of coming across the channel. As I say, the government has been very, very lucky, really, that we're not on much higher numbers and that we haven't already surpassed last year's total because of the bad weather that there has been in the channel.
Because, as you always say, weather is basically the only deterrent.
100%. These are flimsy boats at the end of the day, even though...
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Next UK, your go-to for real stories and sharp analysis.